Likutei Sichos, Chelek Chavtes, volume 29, the first Sicha for parsha Shoftim. This Sicha will explain the true meaning of the first two words of the parsha, Shoftim and Shotrim, and also how it parallels to the famous words Naaseh V'Nishma, and how it applies to the day-to-day observance of Torah, of Mitzvos. As a quick introduction, to be familiar with some of the concepts that we mentioned in the Sicha, there's a pasuk in the book of Hosea. The prophet says, Kinar Yisrael v'ohaveu. Literally translated for Israel was like a young child, and therefore I loved him. Hashem is describing basically his encounter when he quote-unquote met us in Mitzrayim. We were like a little child. We were void of any particular virtues, because we didn't have any mitzvahs or anything. In fact, we were perhaps not at all in that line of mitzvahs. And yet Hashem says, I love you like one loves a little child. And that is actually perhaps the deepest connection that we have with Hashem, like a child and his parents. Then of course, Naaseh V'Nishma. Now, typically everybody says Naaseh V'Nishma means we will do and we will listen. But really, if you think about it, it doesn't make so much sense. Because in order to perform the mitzvahs, one has to first listen, one first has to know, one has to have knowledge. So what does it really mean? We'll get an appreciation of the Sicha, what it really means. There has to be a deeper meaning in Naaseh V'Nishma. Finally, Ratzain versus Tainuk. Ratzain means one's desire, will, literally, and Tainuk is translated as pleasure. We know that just like in a person, you have the intellectual powers, which are higher than the emotional powers, and above the intellectual powers is the willpower, which can be very, very powerful. When somebody wants something, they can perhaps do things sometimes that are actually not even rational or logical, because it's beyond logic. Likewise, so to speak, in the spiritual realm, in the godliness, there is the aspect of chachma, and then you have the spheros, the various attributes. Beyond the intellectual attributes, that is chachma bin adas, you have ratzain, the will of Hashem. And that goes even beyond any whatsoever understanding, even understanding of Torah. However, there's something even higher than that, and that is oineg, pleasure. Now, what is the difference between the two? Each one has its own virtues, so to speak. Ratzain, will or desire, that is something that typically is in equal strength, meaning it is an equal measure, notwithstanding whatever the particular thing is that's being desired. Meaning whether it's a small thing or whether it's a big thing, a desire is a desire. A will is a will. And in that there's what we call no hischalkus. There's no division. There's no real distinction between one another. Whereas when it comes to oineg, to pleasure, well, then there is a big pleasure and there's a small pleasure. Depending on the thing itself is what kind of pleasure it will generate. And finally, where this all comes to play, as we know, the Medrash says that the reason why Hashem made the world is nis'ava HaKadosh Baruch Hu liyos leidir b'tachtonim. That Hashem had a desire. He had a taiva, like one has a desire for something, a desire for pleasure, and that's why he made this world in order to have a dira, dwelling place, down here in the tachtonim, in the lowliest of parts of the world. Let's go into the Sicha. So on the pasuk Shoftim and Shotrim, which literally translates Shoftim means judges, who give opinions, right? Or give rulings. Shotrim literally translates officers, enforcers. On these two words, the Medrash Rabbah says as follows. Rabbi Levi said that what is this compared to? Meaning he's giving a parable, a mashal, to a king that had many sons. However, there was one, the smallest one, that he loved, appreciated more than all of his other sons. Then he had this special orchard that he loved more so than anything else he owned. Says the king to himself, well, I am going to give this orchard, which is so special to me, that I love so much, I am going to give it to my little son, whom I love so much. Likewise, says the Medrash, Hashem said, from all the nations that I created, I don't love anyone as much as I do love Yisrael, the Jewish people. As it says in the Pasuk, says the Medrash, the Pasuk in Hosea, Kinar Yisrael Voyaveu. For the Jewish people are like a little child which one instinctively, innately loves. And therefore, says Hashem, from everything that I created, I don't love anything as much as I love din, which is justice. As it says in Yeshayahu, there's a pasuk in Isaiah that says, Ki ani Hashem oyev mishpat, for I am God who loves justice. So Hashem says, I'm going to give what I love so much, the thing that I love most, to the people that I love most, and thus says the Medrash, Shoftim and Shotrim. Now, of course, there are many questions that immediately pop up. First and foremost, the typical purpose of a parable is to add, to increase, to enhance understanding in the topic. What is not understood of here? Everybody, this is a very obvious and, as we say, a simple, a parsha thing that one is inclined to give the thing that you love most to the person that you love most. I don't need a parable for that. That's number one. Number two, why is the emphasis here of the parable that it was a king? Why do you have to be a king to do this? In other words, where does this enhance the understanding, the appreciation of what's happening here? Everybody's like that. A regular father, regular mother, regular parent, or a regular teacher gives that which they love more to the student or to the child that they love most. So why does it have to be a king? Another question. How can we say that Hashem says, from everything I created, the thing that I love the most is judgment? It's true that you need to have justice, you need to have din, you need to have mishpat. It's an imperative for the world to continue to exist, right? There shouldn't be anarchy. But how can you say that this is something that you love the most? In other words, how can this be, so to speak, like a virtue or an objective in itself? And then finally the question, what is this emphasis here that because we are the smallest, we're like a little child, because we're katan, nar Yisrael v'ayaveu, therefore mishpat was given to us. Therefore Hashem gave us this special gift of mishpat. If you think about it, it would seem that this is actually should be the opposite way around. That for mishpat, in order to be able to decide, to understand law, to understand justice, and to hand down justice, you need to be great. In fact, the Rambam, in describing the criteria for how whom to appoint for the Sanhedrin, describes how they have to be great. They have to be muflagim b'chachma. They have to be exceptionally smart, and they have to have much knowledge. So you see that it's greatness that is required. So why over here is it stipulated that because they're small? Says the Rebbe, the answer in all of this is that it would seem on the surface that we don't have a particular, we meaning the Jewish people, don't have a particular connection to justice. Because the fact is that justice and appointing judges is something that also B'nai Noach, the non-Jews of the world, are obligated to do. It's one of the Sheva Mitzvos B'nai Noach. And moreover, it would seem that it's the idea of justice is not something that's unique and special, right? Because it's not something that you have a, so to speak, a purpose in itself. Rather, it's there, as we mentioned before, to keep the world a stable and civilized place. So again, number one, B'nai Noach also have mishpat. And number two, it seems that it's not really a purpose in itself, but it's a means to an end. It's not an end in itself, it's a means to an end, to keep the world civilized and stable. Therefore comes the mashal of Rabbi Levi. Remember, we asked, why do you need the mashal? What is it teaching us? And he's giving us a mashal. He's giving us this parable from a pardes. Remember, he said he had an orchard, a pardes specifically, because this brings out something very special. You see, there's an inherent difference between an orchard, a place where fruits grow, versus fields and gardens. In fields and gardens, the way it's viewed in the Torah is that what grows there are essentials, things that you need and are necessary for survival. Wheat, all kinds of grains, vegetables, things that you need for basic sustenance. Whereas a pardes, an orchard, a place where fruits grow exclusively, that represents the idea of things that are delicacies, things that are not absolutely imperative for one's existence, rather they bring that added pleasure. In other words, what Rabbi Levi is telling us in this medrash is that we're not talking about mishpat in the literal sense, and therefore we have all the questions we have. But rather, this is talking about mishpat on a whole different level. This is justice in a whole different type of level. This is not something of the ordinary type of justice. We're then correct. Why is there a distinction, or what would distinction be? But rather, this is something very specific, something very special, something very enhanced, that A, was given specifically to the Jewish people, and B, this is connected to the fact of Nar Yisrael V'Aveu, because we are, quote, this little child of Hashem, so to speak, and there is an innate love for us. What is the meaning of all of this? You see, the Rambam explains what the purpose, what really is the whole objective of the Shoftim, of the judges of Bnei Yisrael, namely the Sanhedrin. That means they're not just there to disseminate laws, but rather, he writes, quote, Shehem Ikar Torah Sheba'al Peh. They are the essence of the oral law. Number one. Number two, they are the Amudei Ha'ira. They are the pillars of instruction. That means not only do they give over the laws as they are, but they actually establish the laws. They make the laws. And number three, he says, Umehem choik u'mishpat yotzei l'chol Yisrael. That from them, all the judgments and all the statutes go out, meaning they're disseminated to all Yiddish people. That means their job, their objective is to make sure that Torah Sheba'al Peh, Torah, gets to every single Jew. Now this distinguishes things, and this makes the difference between the typical concept of shoftim, of judges, as it would be for Bnei Noach, and as it is lahavdil by us. You see, by Bnei Noach, the judges, the magistrates, their purpose, their role is not to create, not to generate any laws, not to make laws, but rather to uphold the laws as they were already given, as they are. True, they have to study it, and they have to, you have scholars who understand the law, but that is only within the framework of understanding what the law is as it is, and then after having the proper knowledge of being well versed, to disseminate it and to enforce it, and to make sure that the people are aware of it. Whereas by us, Bnei Yisrael, our objective of judges, like the Rambam says, like we mentioned in the Rambam, the purpose of a judge, the task of a judge is Ikar Torah Sheba'al Peh. Hashem entrusted, Hashem gave over to us the Torah Shebiksav, that we should A, learn it well, B, explain it, but not just explain it as it is, but 3, to bring it to the point, to be mechadesh dinim, to actually innovate and bring out new dinim that otherwise don't seem to appear there. And this is when what the Torah says is you should not deviate from what they tell you. In other words, what they tell you, they meaning the Sanhedrin, the true judges, the judges of the Jewish people, the true shoftim, when they tell you something, it may seem like, well, this is foreign. Where is it? I don't see it in the Torah Shebiksav. That is the purpose. The Torah entrusted, the Torah gave, not only entrusted, but also obligated the shoftim to not just read the words as they are, not just accept the law as it is, but to dwell deeper and to therefore be creative and bring out more that's hidden there, so to speak, between the lines. And this is what the Medrash says. This is what the Medrash means when it says that Hashem says, quote, from everything that I created, I don't love anything as much as I love mishpat, and that I'm giving it to the Yidden. Because we're not talking about a regular, quote-unquote, justice that's usually handed down through a magistrate. But rather, we're talking about learning Torah and being mechadesh in Torah. Learning Torah Sheba'al Peh, learning Torah Shebiksav, and through the power of Torah Sheba'al Peh, to innovate and to bring out new things. And now we can truly appreciate the connection to why the whole thing is is contingent upon the fact that we are like Hashem's little child, Nar Yisrael v'Oyavoy. Because the fact that we were given this power to determine, to figure out halacha, this wasn't given to us because we're so great, because of greatness, or because of great wisdom that we may have, or phenomenal intellect, but rather because of the fact that we are one with Hashem. As it says in the Zohar, Yisrael v'Kuchobrichu kulochat, that we are one with Hashem. Now what happens? Where is the true oneness come out? When you have a father and a young child, the child has not yet developed any intellectual skills, any emotional skills, any whatsoever talents. Why does the father love the child? Why is there a oneness, a unity between the father and the child? Because of the virtue of the fact that that child is his child. There's no need for anything. In fact, anything else can impede on it. The virtue of the fact that he is his father and it's a little cute child, that makes it almost beautiful without all the extra added on virtues and talents and expressions of self. Just the virtue of the fact that he's his child. So because we're a little child, so to speak, that makes us one with Hashem, and that is the reason that Hashem gives us the Torah to now dwell into it. Of course you have to be, as it says, we are Am Chacham B'Novin, we're a wise and understanding nation. But that is not the emphasis over here. Over here, the emphasis, the power to be able to dwell into Torah and expand Torah, that comes from the fact that we're Nar Yisrael V'Avihu. How do we apply this in a practical sense? Meaning in our practical avodah. Where do we see this? Where is this expressed? The idea is that when you make yourself small, when you have humility, that's when you get the true power, or we call it balabatishkeit, so to speak, an ownership, if I may, on Torah. That's when you have the power to really appreciate Torah and enhance it. Now we can also appreciate why in the parable, in the mashal, they emphasize the fact that there was a king, melech. Remember we asked, why a melech? It can be anyone, a father, a parent. The answer is because based on what we just explained, the matter that's being given over to us, this power is so exceptional that it takes, so to speak, a king's power to be able to hand something like this over. This is not something that is in the reach, on the power, so to speak, even metaphorically speaking, of your typical quote-unquote parent, of your typical father transmitting to his son, to his child. Rather, this is something that a king that has enormous power, and in this case, of course, this is a parable for Hashem, therefore they're able to give this power, to allocate it to us. Now, this idea of Shoftim, as we just explained it, that it means to the enhancement, the appreciation, the expansion of the ideas, even leading to new halachas and new conclusions, Shoftim v'Shotrim. This idea of Shoftim v'Shotrim applies to each and every one of us in the observance of our mitzvahs. Because this idea of Shoftim, we have to have the appreciation. We need to know in order to, it's not just merely to an enforcement means, but rather we need to understand, we can know and understand and appreciate and therefore have the full extent of the mitzvahs, how we're supposed to do. This idea is in each and every single mitzvah, not just generally speaking in all mitzvahs, but in each and every single mitzvah. Because the truth is that you cannot do a mitzvah without having this aspect of Shoftim. Now the Rebbe will take it to the next level. The Rebbe will show us how the idea of Shoftim and Shotrim, to have Shoftim, the judges, and Shotrim, the officers, so to speak, this idea, these concepts, actual apply in the observance of every single mitzvah to every single Jew, and in short, it parallels with Naaseh V'Nishma. And if we'll break it down this way. Shoftim, as we just explained, will correspond to Nishma. What does Nishma mean? Nishma means to understand, as we said, not just to know the law and to disseminate the law as it is, but to have a deeper understanding, and to have understanding in such a manner that you can almost generate, right, through chidushim, you can almost generate new ideas, new mitzvahs within the Torah. to contemplate and understand the Torah to such a degree. Shotrim, officers, will correspond with Naaseh. Because think about it, what is the duty of these officers, of these bailiffs? To impose the law, to implement it, to enforce it, make sure the people are doing what they have to do. That's what Naaseh is. Kabbalah said, we're doing what we have to do. Now on the surface, it would seem that which role is greater? Which role is more essential? The Shotrim. It would seem so. Why? Because they're the ones who enforce it, so it's the actual implementation, the actual fulfillment of the mitzvahs, right? They tell you what to do. However, what we learn from the Medrash is that no, the Shoftim are actually greater. In other words, the Nishma is greater. The Nishma is actually an objective which is greater than the Naaseh. And this helps us explain something which on the surface no one even pays attention to, but really it's a phenomenon. It's a fundamental question. What do these words Naaseh V'Nishma mean? The way most people interpret it, it actually seems absurd. The order seems to be wrong. Naaseh, we're going to do. We have Kabbalah soil. We're going to do whatever Hashem wants us to do. V'Nishma, then we're going to hear. How can you do something without hearing and knowing what you have to do? Especially considering that many, many mitzvahs require at least some basic level of appreciation of the mitzvah, the kavanah, of some intent, some meditation, something in order to do the mitzvah properly. So what does this mean, Naaseh V'Nishma? Now we can appreciate it. The Naaseh is the fundamental Shoftim V'Shotrim, or more so Shotrim, in the literal sense, that you have basically, what do I have to do? The law as it is, understanding the law, and if the law requires, the mitzvah requires kavanah, a better, deeper appreciation and contemplation, fine, so be it. But at the end of the day, it all fits into Naaseh. This is Kabbalah soil. Nishma is taking it to the next level. That's the Shoftim aspect, as we just explained. Now, it would seem that once I'm doing whatever Hashem wants me to do, once I'm doing the Naaseh, what more is left? What more can I do? Or what more should I do? What more is available? In fact, it would seem almost that Nishma, meaning starting to dwell into it and to try to understand it on a deeper level and kind of make problems by asking the questions, actually perhaps is a detriment. This is what the lesson here is. That the teaching is that the Yidden, and this is what Hashem appreciated so much, and this is why he likes us. Because we said we're not only going to do it at a fundamental Kabbalah soul, but we're also going to ask, we're going to endeavor to understand and to expand. That is an objective in itself. That's what this Medrash is teaching us. The aspect of Shoftim, or here in this case, the aspect of Nishma, that is an endeavor itself, way surpassing, or way beyond even the actual observance of the mitzvah. Because with Hashem, what was his desire? What was his true will? As we introduced in the beginning, he said, that Hashem ultimately desired to have a dira b'tachtoinim, to have a full dwelling place here in the lower worlds. Now, if it's just in action that one is connecting to Hashem through Maisa, by Naaseh or Shotrim, then it's not a full-fledged dira b'tachtoinim, because it's not the complete person, it's not a whole experience. But rather, when you have it in all aspects, when a person also applies it to their understanding, even though it's difficult and it can be challenging and it can create a lot of questions before you get answers. But then that's where you have the full-fledged tachtoinim, in the full experience of the person who's down here in the earth, now fully connects to Hashem through the mitzvahs and the understanding of the mitzvahs. Now, this idea of Naaseh V'Nishma, as we explained it in the general sense, you have the Naaseh V'Nishma, you also have it in each particular mitzvah. Because we just explained it generally how it applies to all mitzvahs. But the truth is that in each mitzvah, you have these two aspects. And we'll explain it this way. Every single mitzvah, when we make a bracha, we have kind of the same template. We say the same blessing. Asher kiddushanu b'mitzvos v'tzivanu. To do such and such. Now, it's regardless if it's a big mitzvah or a small mitzvah. If it's a very exciting mitzvah, so to speak, or one that we do every single day. We say the same thing. Because really, generally speaking, every single mitzvah we do, whether it's a small or a big mitzvah, it's an exciting mitzvah, it's a very momentous one, The fact is, they all fall into the same category, fall into the same line. We are fulfilling Hashem's will. And there's no difference between one mitzvah and the other. Then, however, because it's a general Kabbalah soil, I'm doing what Hashem wants. That's the Naaseh. But then there is, in every single mitzvah, its particular expression, its particular, so to speak, pleasure that Hashem has. That is something unique. That corresponds to the Nishma. That corresponds to the idea of the Shoftim. And that's something that one has to actually pinpoint and appreciate to really fully get the full experience, to understand how this connects not just to the Ratzain of Hashem, which is, generally speaking, as we said in the introduction, Ratzain has no hischalkus. There isn't a bigger Ratzain. You want or you don't want. And therefore, every single mitzvah is part of Hashem's Ratzain, Hashem's desire. Hashem wanted it to be. So then in that case, there's no difference between one mitzvah and another, a big mitzvah or a small mitzvah. But then there is the particular oineg in every mitzvah, and that is the greatest point, and that is where the nishma comes to play, or the shoftim aspect of things, in order to truly appreciate and understand that particular mitzvah and enjoy that moment because Hashem is enjoying it, so to speak. To conclude, parsha Shoftim is always, without fail, read in the beginning of Elul. Thus, it has a connection to Elul. One of the main practices of Elul also expressed this idea of Shoftim. What is it? Sounding of the shofar. We know that the reason why it's called shofar, there's actually two opposite meanings. Shofar, it says one reason why we sound the shofar, because it's matul emu v'fachad. It actually casts a fear on people, on us. But then, it's also explained that shofar comes from the word shapir, which means tainug, pleasure, because it generates the highest level of pleasure. So, as we explained, it has both aspects in it. You see, as the Tzemach Tzedek explains, they actually both combine. Because the idea of shofar, the mitzvah of shofar draws down from the highest level of tainug, of Hashem, therefore it has the effect, or seems to have the effect, of being matul emo v'fachad, casting a sense of fear, because it makes the person very, very humble. When the higher the revelation, the more humble, the more small, the more scared, so to speak, the person feels. So it actually goes hand in hand. So you have the both aspects of the Shoftim and the Shotrim also in the idea of blowing shofar, and that's the connection to Chodesh Elul. And of course, as the Medrash concludes there, that through dwelling into this aspect of Mishpat, we're going to affect that immediately Hashem will redeem us a full and absolute Geula.